I used to live near where he lived in Newtown and Welshpool. Robert Owen, who lived during this time, he became a spiritualist at the end of his life, having spent his whole life campaigning for trade unions, for workers' rights, for social equality, for an end to poverty. He realised that we're not going to get the socialist utopia we all want until people realise about the spiritual world. You know, this life isn't the only one. We can't do everything in one life. We get several goes to perfect the world. The world is a work in progress, and each life we can do a little bit more to make humanity happier, wiser and more beautiful. So Robert Owen said to really build socialism we have to have a spiritual transformation of the way we think. If we still think in a sort of medieval way that we're all being punished for sin, and that when we die we go to hell, and that if you let those people think too freely, not only are they going to hell, but you're going to go to hell, then you have to control everything and do heretic hunting, which is why the Catholic Church tried to persecute Kardec. So what Robert Owen said is, no, if we change the way people think that after death there isn't a hell, there's a karmic process of evaluation when you say, I could have done better that bit. Let me have another go, God. I want to go back in and do it better next time. You know, if people thought like that, like the world is more like a school for souls, as Keats said, there wouldn't all be this fear and damnation and hell and guilt. And that is what justifies capitalism, said Owen. You see, the capitalist mill owners were often kind of hell-believing Christians that believed that if their workers don't work well enough, well, you'll go to hell, you know. And if I stop your wages and you go on strike, well, I'm going to get the army in because you're all evil, protesting socialist atheist types. So we're going to get the full weight of the church and the army down on you. And Robert Owen said, no, enough. Let's bring enlightenment to people. So he set up a factory which educated the children of the workers, which encouraged men and women to work in nice conditions and not like 20 hours a day in freezing conditions, which they've done, i.e. not to be exploited. So for him, socialism was an ethical choice, and his spiritualism was very important. Now, what happened after he died is this medium, Emma Britton, picked up messages from him. So Robert Owen was now in heaven, still saying, I'm trying to help humanity, can anyone hear me? And Emma Britton, who was a great medium, picked up the message. And he transmitted 7 principles for a reborn humanity, which became the founding code of the Association of Spiritualist Churches in the UK. And when I was teaching religious studies in Britain, I'd go to all the different religions. I would go to the mosques, the synagogues, the gurdwaras, but I would also go to the spiritualist churches. And most of them had these the 7-fold principles transmitted by Robert Owen from the afterlife through Emma Britton. And they're beautiful. I mean, from memory, it's like the fatherhood of God, fatherhood, motherhood, the absolute. There is one. The brotherhood of humanity, we're all brothers and sisters, so we needn't fight over who's top boss. You know, you don't have to give polonium sandwiches to people just because they're teachers. And the need for, and yes, there isn't a hell. There are just successive stages of heaven. Like the beginning stage of heaven is like, I don't know, like Oxford University, kind of like everyone in the library. I mean, to me that would be heaven, right? But that's just the beginning stage. It gets better and better and better, right? Whereas I suppose if you're an engineer, heaven would be like a Leonardo da Vinci workshop where there's every gadget and tool and you can make stuff and do painting and, But anyway, so read Robert Owen's principles of spiritualism. It was also important in that time, the Victorian age. Sir William Gladstone, who was a great Prime Minister, the best liberal Prime Minister in Britain's history, he was a spiritualist. He used to go to mediums and get messages like, how can I be a better Prime Minister? And I admire his humility. He was a Christian, an Anglican like me, but he also wanted to get advice from God. I mean, why wouldn't you? he was quite quiet about it. It wasn't really like broadcast during his day, but we discovered after his death that he was doing that. And we also know that Queen Victoria was as well, the monarch. She was a friend of Gladstone, and they were kind of part of a secret society who felt that monarchs and prime ministers and rulers should be in contact with the spiritual world to give guidance to humanity, which kind of makes sense to me. And we also know that Abraham Lincoln, who was the president of America in the tragic American Civil War, he also used to go to spiritualists, and his wife was a firm believer. In the White House, they would have mediums doing, channeling. We now call it channeling. So it became quite a big movement in the 19th century. And another person that was into it was Lord Arthur Balfour, who was a Scottish Conservative Prime Minister. And he wrote the Balfour Declaration, which led to the founding of the State of Israel. Now, he was a spiritualist from this Victorian era. I've always thought that Balfour should have put a sort of clause into the Balfour Declaration saying, yeah, but make sure you don't do wars with Palestinians and Israelis. Make sure there's peace. Otherwise, the spiritual world will get really annoyed. I feel that the Balfour Declaration should have had a sort of spiritualist clause that why can't mediated teams of Israelis and Palestinians go and do some seances together and get advice from the respective angels that guard these two people, like Gabriel and Michael or whatever you want to say, and make a spiritually based peace treaty so that Palestinians and Israelis can live happily together in the kingdoms of God. Now that would be what Balfour would say. I mean, you could probably channel that if you were a medium. And that to me makes much more sense than killing the other because they have different colour skin or different language or Arabic or, So I think Balfour would want a spiritually based peace like me. Frank Podmore was another great spiritualist in the 19th century who was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, and he became a founder of the Fabian Society, which was a think tank for progressive left-wing thought in London and Britain to solve the tragedy of poverty. Why are people now sleeping on the streets, dying of cold in Europe? I mean, it's shocking. Podmore set up the Fabian Society with others to create, it was like the think tank of the Labour Party. I used to belong to it when I lived in London, and it's still very much needed. I mean, there are people in Britain now dying of cold, starvation, hunger, living on food banks, because the right wing that doesn't care about them has done Brexit, because it can make a few more extra pounds in their bank balances. So Podmore, another spiritual socialist, if you want, a great man. And another one that I know a bit about is Alfred Russel Wallace, another spiritualist, who was a scientist and a friend of Charles Darwin. He was a naturalist and a biologist and zoologist, and he went on expeditions to Indonesia and gathered specimens of everything, like birds and frogs and trees and snails and everything, and shipped them back to London and then discovered that there is this thing called evolution and that all the species are interlinked through a long evolutionary tree. And he got very ill. He had malaria or something and was like in a trance state. And he saw the theory of natural selection. He realized that how evolution works is because the things that aren't quite fitting in the environment tend to die off. They don't replicate, they don't have kids, they don't have offspring. And so over time, nature manages that the best suited for a given niche of ecology will survive and flourish. And, it seems a bit harsh, but that's how nature works. Theory of natural selection and evolution. And Wallace had this like a brainwave. Nobody had worked that out quite in that way. And he wrote to this colleague, Charles Darwin, who he'd heard of and respected, and said, I've had this amazing idea. it's called Evolution Theory of Natural Selection. What do you think, Charles? And Charles had the same idea, but had never published on it. He'd never written it up, and it sat in his drawer in sort of like note form. And because Wallace wrote this letter, Darwin then felt a sort of friendly rivalry. Oh my God, I can't have him publish it first. So he wrote up his paper, and then they made a gentleman's agreement. They presented both papers to the Linnaean Society, named after Linnaeus, the great Swedish biologist who named all the species. We use Linnaean classification language. Every species, whether a plant or an animal, has two Latin names. And that's Linnaeus's doing. So the Linnaean Society in London is one of the world's leading centres for biological thinking. And so these papers are read to it at the same time. I don't think either Wallace or Darwin were present, but it was done by proxies. And so the theory of natural selection was launched on the world. Okay. And soon after that, Darwin wrote his book about evolution, and he got all the limelight. So everyone thinks of Darwin when they think of evolution by natural selection, and you study evolution at university, you're taught about Darwin. I think Wallace was the better thinker, and because he was more humble, and he didn't say that this theory of natural selection evolution explains everything about human beings. He said, and he did it because he'd been to some seances and he'd had some sittings with mediums about one of his dead relatives, and they brought information that nobody else could have known. There's no way that they could have been faking it, right? He was convinced, therefore, 100% that these mediums can contact the spirits of the dead. Now, if that's true, he said, as a scientist, well, it means I can't have a purely materialist view of the human being. There must be a soul or something that survives death and maybe reincarnates, And if that's true, then natural selection can't explain everything. There must be, and I've coined the word supernatural selection. Evolution by supernatural selection, which is my coinage, which is, for instance, if two people meet and fall in love, that's a supernatural thing often. I mean, it might be strange synchronicities, they meet friends of friends, the experience of falling in love is like a supernatural idea. And of course it doesn't happen with everyone, it's just maybe one person that you meet in your life, or one or two or something. And when that happens, that's the evolutionary force of spirit saying, let's bring a new child of love into the world. Now that's what supernatural selection is. And that's what Alfred Russel Wallace would have agreed with. He was looking for a deeper theory of evolution that is deeper than just genes and the physical stuff. Anyway, he was a great man, and he ended up in Poole, and he belonged to the Bournemouth Spiritualist Church. He became vice president of it. And when I was head of religious studies in Poole Grammar School for 2 years, I used to go every Thursday to the Bournemouth Spiritualist Church, and we'd hear lectures from people all over the country, great mediums and things. And there was a picture of Wallace, on the wall, looking down on us. And then I discovered that he was buried in the Poole Cemetery. His tomb was there. So I organised the Wallace Memorial Lectures when I was in the grammar school position as head of religious studies, and I got 400 boys or whatever to come and listen to a lecture by visiting intellectuals. And one of them was one of the leading thinkers behind the Scientific and Medical Network, a medical doctor who's looked at near-death experiences and stuff. He came and gave the launch lecture. And then I had a couple of people involved in the Bournemouth Spiritualist Church come and give a talk. And so I think that we should honour Wallace's memory, bring back knowledge of him, to balance that of Darwin, because he was a scientific spiritualist. And another reason why I think Wallace is interesting is because I researched his biography. He went to America, he travelled, gave lectures. He's a big Victorian guy with a long white beard, right? Looked like a druid. And he became friends with this American millionaire, Leland Stanford. who was a railroad guy, who had just bought a bunch of land south of San Francisco where he's going to found a university, which was going to be called Stanford University. And he took Wallace to the land, which was full of redwoods, and you could look down and see the sea's edge and stuff. And how's it going to be, Wallace? Is this a great university or what? And Wallace kind of gave his blessing to the idea. And Stanford was a strong believer in spiritualism. His son had died, and he'd had definite messages through. And Stanford wanted his new university to be a haven of free thought, where you could do things like study spiritualism and research ultimate truth without being accused of heresy and stuff. So I would love to have sat in on the conversations between Wallace and Stanford. Now fast forward, Stanford founded that university, and that university, Stanford University, is the haven of the modern digital age, because it's there that the electronic revolution was done and the computer chips were invented. The Silicon Valley is around Stanford University, and it was academics in Stanford that invented the silicon chip, invented the modern computer, invented the digital age. Now I think that's Stanford's dream coming true. He wanted freedom of information and knowledge to circulate all over the world without heretic fears, as did Wallace. And they wanted knowledge, scientific knowledge of spirituality to flourish. And it's happening because of the internet. You know, you can't, I mean, things like this talk that I record and my classes, you know, the dark forces can't block this knowledge anymore, thanks to Stanford and his university. And so we owe him and Wallace a thank you for this. Okay, so that's spiritualism. I've got down, I reckon there's about 5 million people that follow this tradition. They might be from different religions, a lot of them are Christian, but there are spiritualists who are Buddhist and Hindu. I mean, it's compatible with all the religions, Islam, Sufism and so on. And I reckon there's been about 150 million in the whole of history, if you sort of count back, who followed this path. Another important guy is called Arthur Findlay, who was a Scottish entrepreneur, quite wealthy. He became a spiritualist. And he endowed a college in Britain for the training of spiritualist mediums. It's called Findlay College. And, you know, I've known friends who've trained there and studied there. And spiritualist churches tend to go there on pilgrimage. It's like their Oxford University, if you want. And I've always wanted to go there and study in the library, but I haven't made it there yet. But anyway, so that's spiritualism. I think it's an interesting tradition, and it's in the New Religious Movement box. Okay, next we're going to look at 98, but we'll have a little break first. Thank you.